For years, Moscow relied on the myth that no external shock could threaten its economy. But in November 2025, that myth collapsed. Ukraine struck key refineries, paralyzing pipelines and disrupting critical supply chains. At the same time, China, its largest buyer, began turning its back, leaving Russia with stranded oil and no way out. With no exports, no revenue, and no partners, Putin's so-called energy fortress is falling apart in front of the world. Today, you will see how this double blow exposed the greatest weakness of modern Russia and why it cannot win a conflict it can no longer afford to finance. The truth behind these attacks only becomes clear when we understand the real weight oil carries inside the Russian machine. Oil is not just a commodity for Moscow, it is the state's primary source of revenue. In some years, it accounts for more than 35% of the federal budget and nearly half of all the country's exports. This money keeps the ruble alive, pays government salaries, funds military programs, and sustains logistics operations in Ukraine. Every barrel shipped generates taxes that go straight into the Russian treasury, and every disruption in that flow hits the Kremlin's financial core. When Ukraine destroys refineries and when China reduces purchases, it is not just oil that disappears, it is war money evaporating. And that brings us to the second point. Oil is not just revenue, it is combat fuel. Without diesel, no T-72, T-80 or T-90 moves an inch. Without TS-1 aviation fuel, no Su-35, K-52 or Mi-28 takes off. Without gasoline and lubricants, ammunition trucks, engineering vehicles, and logistics armor simply stop on the roadside. Modern war runs on petroleum derivatives, and Russia depends heavily on specific refineries to keep that flow steady. That is why these facilities have become such valuable targets. Refineries like Saratov, Orsknefteorgsintez, Ryazan, Kirishi, Novochakhtinsk, and Syzran form a critical map that sustains military operations from the Baltic to the Caucasus. Many of them sit hundreds of miles from the front line, but they are far from protected. They are fixed, massive, predictable, and impossible to move. After understanding how deeply oil sustains both Moscow's economy and its war effort, Ukraine's new strategy starts to make perfect sense. It is not enough to hit tanks on the battlefield. You have to erase the fuel that makes them exist. And that is why, in November 2025, Kiev intensified a surgical offensive against the refineries that feed the entire Russian machine. Among all the facilities struck, Saratov is perhaps the most emblematic case. Located along the Volga and operating as one of the main production hubs of European Russia, the refinery had already been attacked repeatedly, and the November strike marked the 7th hit in 2025 alone. The plant produces more than 20 types of derivatives, including automotive gasoline, low-sulfur diesel, industrial kerosene, and petrochemical components used by the military industry. Each interruption in Saratov is not just an isolated fire. It is a temporary collapse across multiple supply chains that serve entire regions. Previous attacks had already forced Russia to run the refinery in an unstable state, with sections operating below capacity. The most recent blow, however, struck heating areas and critical pipelines, causing a secondary burn that shut down part of the production. For Moscow, keeping Saratov running has become a race against time, and against Ukrainian drones that keep finding weaknesses. The second major blow fell on the Orsknefteorgsintez refinery in the Orenburg region. This facility is one of the largest outside Western Siberia, with the capacity to process 6.6 million tons of crude per year, enough fuel to supply thousands of military vehicles and keep a regional air force operating. The November attack triggered explosions in heating tanks, rupturing internal lines and setting off a fire that was extremely difficult to control. The flames were so intense that crews had to shut down entire sections of the plant to prevent the fire from reaching cracking and hydrogenation units, which are highly sensitive. For Ukraine, hitting Orsk means striking not just production, but specialized refining capability, something Russia cannot quickly replace. For Moscow, each day of suspended operation translates into less military fuel available and less export revenue. In occupied Crimea, another vital point entered the crosshairs: the Feodosia maritime terminal. Unlike a refinery, the terminal is Russia's gateway for shipping oil into the Black Sea, and simultaneously one of the key points responsible for supplying Russian units in southern Ukraine. When Ukrainian drones struck storage tanks and transfer pipelines, the immediate shutdown created a massive logistical bottleneck. Oil tankers were left without cargo, local stockpiles could not be replenished, and Russian units along the Zaporizhzhia-Crimea axis saw a reduction in operational fuel. Feodosia is so strategic that, without it, Russia must reroute oil through much longer land routes, putting even more pressure on already overloaded rail lines. The central point is simple. Without fuel, the Russian war machine stalls. The combined destruction of Saratov, Orsk, and Feodosia means less diesel for transport vehicles and armor, less kerosene for helicopters and fighter jets, less gasoline for rapid troop movement, and fewer industrial lubricants for maintenance. The effect multiplies because Russia relies on long rail routes to move refined fuel to the front line. And when a refinery goes down, the distance to the next distribution center increases dramatically. With each attack, Ukraine forces Moscow to operate with smaller stockpiles, longer routes, and higher costs. And in a war where mobility, supply, and replenishment determine who keeps the momentum, Russia is starting to lose something it cannot replace: time and operational capacity. On paper, Russia still had one card left to offset part of these losses: China. But the very partner that was supposed to guarantee stability became yet another source of chaos. Putin's so-called energy fortress was not attacked only by drones, it was also squeezed by the fear of sanctions coming from the other side of the planet. From the start of the war, after Europe began cutting imports, Beijing became the main buyer of Russian oil. It was China that absorbed a massive share of the barrels that once went to European refineries, taking advantage of steep discounts. For Moscow, that meant two things: keeping the minimum cash flow needed to fund the state, and proving internally that the world has not abandoned Russia, while Chinese money flowed in through pipelines and oil tankers. Without this market, Russian oil is not just less profitable, it becomes literally stranded, stuck in storage tanks while the war budget continues burning billions each month. But the United States did not accept this rearrangement passively. Washington tightened sanctions against Russian giants like Rosneft and Lukoil, targeting not just the companies themselves, but the entire network around them: shipping firms that transport their oil, maritime insurers, banks that process payments, and most importantly, foreign refineries that continued buying these shipments. The message was blunt: anyone doing business with these companies could end up in the line of fire of secondary sanctions. In practice, that scares any major player. This is not just about losing access to a supplier. It is about risking access to the dollar system, Western markets, international insurance, and technology. It is a risk no state conglomerate takes lightly, not even in Beijing. Under this pressure, large Chinese state refineries began pulling back. Companies like Yancheng Petroleum suspended purchases of certain batches of Russian oil specifically to avoid being directly linked to Rosneft, Lukoil, and other firms under US sanction scrutiny. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated decision. Cut the riskiest contracts, reduce exposure to ships and cargoes contaminated by sanctions, and prioritize suppliers that do not drag China into direct confrontation with the US Treasury. For Russia, the message is devastating. When even major Chinese state companies start avoiding your oil, you stop being a strategic partner and become a financial liability. What remains are smaller buyers, second-tier traders, more opaque schemes, even steeper discounts, and shrinking profit margins for Moscow. At the center of this shift lies a simple dilemma. China wants a useful Russia, one that distracts the West, weakens NATO, fractures European unity. But it does not want a Russia so toxic that it drags Beijing into the heart of American sanctions. And the calculus is cold. China's trade with the United States and the European Union moves trillions of dollars every year, while Russian oil, though important, is only a fraction of that equation, and already comes at a discount. If Beijing has to choose between keeping a discount on Russian crude or protecting its access to Western markets, the choice is obvious. That is why, in practice, China does not break with Moscow in its rhetoric, but it abandons Putin where it hurts the most: in the cash flow. When your biggest buyer cuts purchases and your main refineries are damaged, Russia is not facing just a logistics problem. It is facing a systemic collapse that hits the economy, the war effort, and domestic politics all at the same time. The sum of these factors is exactly what turns an energy crisis into a national crisis. The first consequence appears where Moscow feels it the fastest: export revenue. With China hitting the brakes, and with terminals and refineries operating at reduced capacity, Russia is forced to sell less oil and sell it cheaper. Every barrel that once left with a moderate discount now has to be reduced even further to attract secondary buyers in Asia. This drastically shrinks federal revenue, and at the same time, the government must subsidize fuel domestically. With damaged refineries and the risk of shortages, Moscow controls prices to avoid social unrest. But that control comes at a cost. The state pays the difference to keep gasoline and diesel artificially cheap. In other words, less money comes in, more money goes out, and the deficit grows at an accelerated pace. Russia's extreme dependence on energy revenue makes the impact both immediate and deep. The Kremlin is forced to choose where to cut: social programs, investments, ammunition, spare parts, financial support for occupied regions. Each Ukrainian strike and each Chinese pullback increases that pressure. The second consequence is even more direct. Without fuel, there is no large-scale war. The strikes on Saratov, Orsk, and Feodosia have already reduced supply and lengthened distribution routes. Now, with lower production and fewer external buyers ensuring steady cash flow, Russia must prioritize what it fuels. This creates a hierarchy of urgency. Tanks receive less diesel, helicopters fly with smaller operational windows, ammunition trucks delay resupply, and forward units operate at the bare minimum of fuel. In practice, this results in less mobility, fewer sustained offensives, less ability to react quickly, and greater vulnerability to ambushes, drones, and precision strikes. The Russian military becomes dependent not on what it wants to do, but on what it can afford to fuel. And that is the kind of limitation no propaganda can hide. Lastly, an effect emerges that the Kremlin fears more than any missile: dissatisfaction within its own borders. With tight stockpiles and overloaded routes, some regions begin facing rising fuel prices, lines at gas stations once considered safe, temporary supply interruptions. For a population already strained by inflation, war casualties, and declining purchasing power, a spike in diesel and gasoline prices is a powerful emotional trigger. Transportation becomes more expensive, food prices climb, businesses slow down. This creates a cascading effect that hits voters, oligarchs, and regional officials, all of them weighing how much internal stability they are willing to sacrifice to keep the war going. Russia has just taken a double blow that strikes directly at the heart of its war-fighting capability. On one side, Ukraine has dismantled an essential part of its oil infrastructure. On the other, China, its biggest buyer and last financial cushion, has begun to pull back to avoid American sanctions. With refineries no longer operating at full capacity and with barrels stranded, Moscow is losing money, losing fuel, and losing time. What comes next is an equation full of uncertainty. Russia is trying to find new buyers, but none of them carry the economic weight of China. Ukraine, seeing the results, is unlikely to slow down its strategic strikes, and Beijing will only return to the Russian market if doing so does not threaten its own interests, something that becomes less likely by the day. In the end, this conflict shows that modern war is decided not only in trenches, but also in pipelines, maritime terminals, and political decisions made thousands of miles away. And for Moscow, all of these battlefields are starting to turn against it. And if you think the energy and financial crisis has pushed Moscow against the wall, wait until you see what is happening with Beijing. Because while Russia struggles to survive the collapse of its own oil lifeline, China has just discovered something even worse. The United States and its allies have built an invisible blockade in the Pacific, a wall of missiles capable of turning its entire fleet into targets. And what began with strikes in Ukraine now connects directly to a military shift that could redefine the global balance of power. Click on the video appearing on your screen and see how Australia, armed with new strike systems, has become the peace Beijing can no longer contain. And do not forget to subscribe to the Military Ground. See you there.